everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers, particularly to Conor and Owen for their invitation to be with you this afternoon, and congratulations to everybody here for hanging on. It has been a very stimulating day, but nonetheless, I think it's hugely commendable that you're all here and late into a Sunday afternoon. I'm conscious I stand between you and your week of work, with the exception of Emily Logan, so I will also, like Dermot, endeavour to be as efficient as possible in my observations. Looking at the commemorations around the 1916 event from a children's rights perspective has been interesting. Looking at in particular, I suppose, the efforts that were made to bring the events of 1916 into every school in the country, the delivery of the national flag, and that's been a really important process of engaging children and young people in remembering the events, and also in work that we've been supporting with the Department of Children to build children's own vision around Ireland and for the next century. But I think the work of Joe Duffy has been really instrumental also in allowing us to address the invisibility of children in and around the events of 1916. His work, of course, has gone through and developed the narratives of the 40 children who were killed during those days. And I think it's been a really important contribution, interesting perhaps that it was made not in the academic sphere. I think, though, there's also another story to be told, perhaps building on from Joe Duffy's work around the participation of children in the armed conflict itself. And we know that 3 of the 40 were active in the armed conflict in one way or another, and I think there's another story there, I think, about how young people themselves were directly involved. Sean Lemass himself being just 16, holding weapons during that time. So I think there's another story there to be developed still. We all know, of course, that the reference to children in the 1916 proclamation was not a reference to children, but nonetheless that has been used as a sort of clarion call for children's rights advocates. There is, of course, the guarantee of equal rights and opportunities, and I think that's where I want to pick up the children's rights story. I think it's also, although I'm clearly not an historian, important to note that through all of these processes and through the documentary evidence, we don't really see a vision of childhood in Ireland, with the exception perhaps of De Valera's references to the sort of romping of sturdy children. We don't really get a sense of what childhood was envisaged to be like into the future, although of course the vision for Ireland encompassed what it would mean for children. So I'm not looking at those issues directly, but I have set the rather impossible task of reviewing, like Dermot has 100 years of children's rights in Ireland. Not only am I not an historian, I'm not a legal historian, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Regardless, it would be impossible to do justice to Ireland's relationship with children's rights since the Free State in what is probably now about 15 minutes. A further problem though also arises in the analysis from the fact that international children's rights law is actually quite new. It didn't formally begin until the League of Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1924, but really is associated with the beginning in binding international law with the adoption of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. At the same time, it's possible to say that Ireland's children's rights journey mirrors that of the international community, although we are clearly lagging behind. That is to say that it focused in the early years on the vulnerable child in need of protection, the needs of the child for health and education, and has then in the last sort of 3 decades or so increasingly applied the human rights framework that views children as rights holders, individuals worthy of respect in their own right, rather than recipients of charity and patronage. And it's my view that despite Ireland's appalling treatment of children, some of which continues to this day, Ireland would never have recognised the individual rights of children, most notably in Article 42A of the Constitution, were it not for the international consensus surrounding the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there's plenty of analysis of the transformative impact of the CRC on Irish law and policy, and I'm not going to repeat that here. But rather to undertake a children's rights analysis taking into account socioeconomic rights and the whole range of particular rights associated with children's development and environment. Looking at those here in the Ireland since the Free State. But rather than undertaking a comprehensive analysis, want to focus on two things. First of all, the tracing of that progress in the protection of children's rights, focusing particularly on those socioeconomic rights and institutional care of children. Here, although I think we can see the very substantial progress made in the last 100 years in improving children's lives, specifically in health and education, we have a very serious blight on our record with the institutionalising of children and the abuse that this involved. The second question is perhaps a more difficult one. I want to ask to what extent we have moved, as international law has done, from a welfare or charity-based view of children to a rights-based approach. So looking at the first issue around children's socioeconomic rights, clearly international law requires that children have a right, or recognises that children have a right to an adequate standard of living, the highest attainable standard of health and healthcare, the right to education on the basis of equal opportunity. Families are entitled to support from the state, and children are entitled to grow up in the care of their families with detention and institutional care as a last resort. A very quick review of statistical data makes clear that on some of these metrics at least, children's rights have improved since the establishment of the Free State. A couple of examples. Average daily attendance in national schools in 1916 was about 70%. School attendance that had been compulsory since 1892 began to fall off rapidly as many children left to work in factories or on farms at very young ages. It's now at about 94%, so in 2013, although I do think it's still quite remarkable that 6% of children do not attend school regularly. Nearly 7,000 second-level students took the junior intermediate examination in 1916. 58% of those candidates were male. In 2015, there were just under 60,000 candidates for the junior certificate exam. About 50% of the candidates were male. The suitability of that education, of course, and access to education without discrimination, and its relevance to all children is a question for another day. Nonetheless, these are significant achievements now. During the early and mid-1900s, untrained teachers reportedly led to rote learning. The absence of resources meant that children often had responsibility not just for learning, but for actually cleaning the schools. Because fees were charged for secondary schooling, most families couldn't afford to send their children there. And overcrowding in national schools was really a serious issue discussed in the Dáil in very early years and really throughout the 1900s, referencing being made to the lack of school accommodation in particular. Prevailing culture in Irish national schools is perhaps summarised best in 1956 by Dr. Sheehy Skeffington, who noted, "I'm fully aware that very frequently the reason for the administering of corporal punishment in schools arises from conditions quite outside the control of the teachers. Conditions of overcrowding, excessive emphasis upon exam results, and the fact that our education system makes no allowance for the teacher who has to teach backward children in the same class as bright children, makes no allowance for the fact that the teacher is frequently harassed by inspectors of various kinds. The teacher finds himself or herself in classes which come up to as much as 60 in number." Despite ongoing discussion about all of these issues, really, including staff-student ratios, concerns with resourcing of education, the inclusiveness of that education, standards have undeniably improved in our schools. If we look at health, we can see that there is no doubt whatsoever that the health of children has improved in the last 100 years. Infant mortality rate was at 81 in Ireland in 1916, so for every 1,000 babies born, 81 died before they reached 12 months of age. By 2014, the infant mortality rate was very low, 3.7, one of the lowest, in fact, across Europe. A baby boy born in 2011 can expect to live for nearly 25 more years than a boy born in 1911. And life expectancy at birth has increased for females, for girls, from 54 years to 82 years over the same time period. So very significant gains. We've eradicated all of the major diseases from childhood in Ireland in this time. About 1 in 8 deaths in 1916 due to things like bronchitis and pneumonia, with very serious concerns around a range of infectious diseases, really all of which have been eliminated through various processes, including largely schemes of vaccination. We have to say, though, at the same time that very serious problems associated with poor mental health and with obesity, to just name two of the contemporary challenges to children's health, present enormous challenges to the modern-day child in Ireland. The lack of universal healthcare for children, although being addressed, has never really managed to become a political priority since the abandonment of the mother and baby scheme in the 1950s. And I think it's interesting also to note the lack of political priority, notwithstanding the progress made more recently of the new National Children's Hospital, given all of the infrastructure projects we've managed to deliver, to not have a world-class children's hospital is a serious illustration, I think, of our lack of commitment to children in these areas. I think it's also, while I think these progress can be acknowledged, we have to also, I think, note that education and health have improved largely in line with Ireland's economic development and wealth. Disparities, very significant disparities remain, with poverty, disadvantage, and the rights of vulnerable and marginalised groups really seeing much worse outcomes in health and education than mainstream Irish society. So to that extent, we have not delivered on the earlier promises. But turning to institutional care, I think no assessment of Ireland's history with children and children's rights would be complete without acknowledging what is the shameful and prevailing feature of Ireland's treatment of children in the last 100 years. The policy was by no means limited to children, as O'Sullivan and O'Donnell have noted, but it was very significant as a feature of how we treated children. So although in 1916 over 8,000 children lived in either industrial or reformatory schools, and many of those admitted in that year alone were under 8 years of age, the expansion of these systems that took place over the following decades, run by the religious orders but supported by the state, resulted in large-scale institutionalisation of children. The horrific experience of many of these children have been told well in multiple reports, notably the report of the Ryan Commission into Child Abuse, whose confidential committee heard from over 1,000 survivors in over 200 institutions. Quoting from the Ryan report directly, physical and emotional abuse and neglect were features of the institutions. Sexual abuse occurred in many of them. Schools were run in a severe, regimented manner that imposed unreasonable and oppressive discipline on children. The system of large-scale institutionalisation was a response to a 19th century social problem, which was outdated and incapable of meeting the needs of individual children. The defects of the system were exacerbated by the way it was operated by the congregations that owned and managed the schools. This failure led to the institutional abuse of children where their developmental, emotional and educational needs were not met. The deferential and submissive attitude of the Department of Education towards the congregations compromised its ability to carry out its statutory duty of inspection and monitoring. The capital and financial commitment made by the religious congregations was a major factor in prolonging the system of institutional care of children in the state. Ryan notes, for example, that from the mid-1920s in England, by contrast, smaller, more family-like settings were established and they were seen as providing a better standard of care for children in need. In Ireland, however, the industrial school system thrived. The system of funding through capitation grants led to demands by managers for children to be committed to industrial schools for reasons of economic viability of the institutions. The system of inspection by the Department of Education was fundamentally flawed and incapable of being effective. Despite all of the testimony of what happened to children and the impunity enjoyed by those who abused them or were responsible for that abuse, there has been little accountability, despite the apology issued on behalf of the state by An Taoiseach in 1999, and the small numbers admittedly prosecuted through the courts. Ironically, at the time this apology was being issued with a €4 million package to support the survivors of abuse, the state was fighting abuse survivor Louise O'Keeffe in the High Court, in the Supreme Court and ultimately before the European Court of Human Rights. Accountability from the state was precisely what Louise sought, and it took her 15 years to get it when the European Court found in her favour in 2014. Louise wasn't a victim from the institutional care setting and so wasn't covered by any of the abuse inquiries, but she had suffered at the hands of her lay school principal in the 1970s. But it was the same institutional failings, a hopeless child protection system, a dominance of authority over children's protection, that meant her complaint was ignored. The state's response to her legal proceedings, including being told to sue the school's Board of Management, was symptomatic of the contempt with which it greeted those who sought to challenge. The fact that government continues 2 years later to contest the judgment in narrowing its application to those who previously complained of abuse, contrary to the view of many, including the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, makes it clear to me at least that nothing has changed. I've written elsewhere about the failure to respond in a meaningful way to the findings of the Ryan report and the multiple other inquiries into the abuse of children at the hands of their carers. The Ryan Report Implementation Plan, which was launched in 2009, provided impetus to some important developments in the reform of the child welfare system, notably the establishment of the Child and Family Agency, which seeks to give priority in a stretched health service to issues of children care and protection. I think it's disappointing that the child abuse inquiries didn't point more directly to the failure to treat children with respect, to regard children's rights as equally important to those of others, and crucially to ensure the voices of especially marginalised children were heard, and also that the recommendations around these issues weren't focused and didn't ring out more loudly. It's equally disappointing that the recommendations emanating from these reports didn't address more explicitly the need for a radical restatement of Ireland's commitment to children's rights, for example, by incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child into Irish law, or by the inclusion of substantive provisions like the right to protection from harm, the child's right to be heard, into the Constitution. It's significant, I think, that in 2015 the defence of moderate and reasonable chastisement was removed from our statute books, but remarkable perhaps that this came about largely through the determination of an independent senator, Gillian Van Turnhout, rather than as part of any government strategy to protect children from abuse. In fact, the absence of a national plan to protect children has been noted on a number of occasions by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, most recently in January 2016. I think it's important to note, notwithstanding its imperfections, that Ireland's youth justice system has been subjected to sustained, if gradual, reform in the last 30 years. Although its historical and regressive features were associated with the overuse of institutional care rather than a heavily punitive system, the closure of the institutions has been an important feature of our development of the childcare system in the last 20 years, the closure of St Patrick's Institution, as Thomas mentioned, perhaps standing as the most important symbol of the end of that era. I think it's interesting too, though, that came about through sustained pressure from NGOs and others and the spotlight of international bodies, crucial in ensuring that result was delivered. Turning to the second point, I think it's significant that Ireland's legislative history, which is one way clearly of understanding our commitment to children's rights, shows a lack of attention to providing the state infrastructure for children's rights in and to education, health and child protection. We still have no legislation underpinning children's health and healthcare, and the legislation underpinning education was only enacted in 1998. In fact, few pieces of legislation were adopted in the years before Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. The two important exceptions were the Guardianship of Infants Act in 1964, described as the first reforming statute on child law since independence, and the Status of Children Act in 1987, which abolished the concept of illegitimacy. Apart from the introduction of the Children's Allowance in 1944, these were really the only two notable milestones in the state's articulation of its expectations for children. The Mother and Child Scheme proposed in 1951, a topic clearly for another day, perhaps symptomised why the state chose to, or at least was warded off, intervening in these areas. The law and policy agenda has, though, taken on a completely different momentum since Ireland's ratification of the CRC in 1992. The adoption of the Childcare Act 1991, the Children Act 2001, the establishment of the Ombudsman for Children's Office and the Child and Family Relationships Act in 2015 stand out as very significant developments that have increasingly sought to position children at the centre of decision-making in childcare, in family law and in youth justice areas. The adoption of the National Children's Strategy in 2000 and its most recent successor, the awfully titled Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, indicate an engagement with the child as individual that is consistent with a rights approach, even if they are light on substantive rights commitments. And of course, the passing by a very slim majority of the referendum to insert a new provision in the Constitution, Article 42A, is also reflective, I think, of the state's engagement with the implementation of children's rights. It's not necessary, perhaps, to overanalyse the low turnout and the slim majority with which the vote was passed, and indeed the legal challenge it survived. But it is significant that the content of the proposal was weak and limited in terms of its incorporation of children's rights into the Constitution. Although research that we've undertaken, myself and Conor O'Mahony at Cork, have indicated that Ireland is not necessarily out of line internationally in taking the approach it did constitutionally, I think it's important that although Article 42A recognises children as rights holders, with the state as duty bearer, a fundamental shift in our thinking around children's rights in Ireland, the rest of the provision doesn't actually give children's rights any constitutional status, but rather mandates the Oireachtas to advance children's rights in particular areas. Nearly finished. Given that the authority of the state to protect the rights of children, and in fact to promote the rights of children, has been and continues to be questioned, it is perhaps the best that could have been expected in the circumstances. I think it's nonetheless symptomatic of the fact that Ireland continues, as it did in 1916, to proclaim its commitment to the importance of children, but actually to make very little progress in moving on from this rhetoric into more meaningful engagement with children's rights. I do think one of the important things that was struck when I was listening to Marie this morning as well, to reflecting on something that I haven't addressed here, and that's the limited nature of the litigation in children's rights in Ireland. Few, if any, cases have been taken really from a children's rights perspective. And the contrasts to other areas where social policy and criminal justice gains have been made through public interest litigation. Those that have involved children's rights issues have either been unsuccessful or they've been taken from a parent's perspective. The hope, I think, that was set out in Gian on Board Uthal in 1980 really was never built upon in articulating a vision of children's rights that could have clarity from the state's perspective. It is, I think, a matter very clearly articulated elsewhere that there has been a limiting or a chilling effect of the Constitution, which viewed children's rights as a matter for the family and not for the state itself. I think it's also remarkable, though, that the only litigation in which the state has really been directly involved in identifying and sponsoring representation have been in those cases concerning the right to life or abortion, the child before birth, and not the more mainstream, if you like, children's rights cases. I would, I think, conclude by making two or three very quick remarks. One is that it is inescapable, I think, that Ireland has not lived up to the ideals that were promulgated and professed by the leaders of 1916, the architects of the Free State, and in the 1937 Constitution, in prioritising even the welfare of children. We continue to pay lip service and don't back that up with clear political priority to the rights and interests of children. And I think it's clear to say that the rhetoric about the importance of children, although that continues to prevail, when pushed, generally, children lose out to others. That might have been the Catholic Church in the past, continues to be the private dominance of the family, but also other competing interests and claims. But on a more positive note, I think it is possible to see, particularly since Ireland's ratification of the Children's Rights Convention, that this is beginning to change. The symbol of that is Article 42A, which really, in a very radical way, made clear that this relationship is now fundamentally altered, that the responsibility now is on the state to protect the rights of children rather than any other party. Thanks very much for your attention.